Hi, this is Bob. I just wanted to let you know that the conversation you're about to hear and or see is actually two conversations. The first conversation was taped before Russia invaded Ukraine. Then after the invasion, Kishore was kind enough to come back and talk with me a little about how the invasion looks from China's point of view. So that part is at the end of the conversation. While I've got you here, I might as well suggest that if you like The Right Show, you might rate and review us. It really does help. If you don't like The Right Show, forget that I ever even suggested rating or reviewing us. Anyway, now I will get out of the way and let you enjoy a conversation that I really enjoyed and got a lot out of. Hi, Kishore.
Hi, Bob.
How are you doing?
Very well.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Right Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Kishore Mahbubani. Is that correct? Have I?
Absolutely correct.
Okay. Well, that's the last time I'll try the last name. I'm not going to press my luck. I'll stick with the first name from here on out. And you're in Singapore. You are a longtime Singapore diplomat, for one thing. You were Singapore's representative to the United Nations, I think, for a time. And in fact, you were president of the UN Security Council. I'm pretty sure I've never spoken to someone who was president of the UN Security Council. That was 2001, 2002, right?
Actually, in January 2001 and May 2002. Okay. It's 1 month per presidency.
Okay. I see. Okay. So, but those were interesting times in the run up to the Iraq War. We need to revisit that because I want to talk mainly today about China. You have your most recent book is called "Has China Won? The Chinese Challenge to American Primacy." You've written a number of books. You're also an academic, I should say, and you run something called the Asian Peace Program, which people can Google if they're interested in Asian peace. So I want to talk about the things you talk about in your book. And I want to start with the title, Has China Won? That suggests competition. And one thing I'd like to get clearer on in this conversation is what exactly America and China are competing over, and also kind of what they should be competing over. So, for example, maybe one way to start is, suppose you were running the United States, you were president, and you had decided you just wanted to pursue America's interests. That's not the only thing you could consider. You could decide you want to influence China's human rights policy and so on, and we'll get into that. And for that matter, maybe their human rights policy does influence American interests. But I'd like to start with the question of if you were focused on America's interest, what would you think it did make sense to compete with China over, if that makes sense?
Very good question. And I want to emphasize at the very outset that I speak as a friend of the United States of America. My wife was born and brought up in Summit, New Jersey, and two of my children live in the U.S. So I'm not anti-American in any way. But at the same time, as a friend of America, if you see your friend walking towards a cliff, do you tell the friend, keep on walking? Or do you tell the friend, stop, you're going towards a cliff? And that's exactly what America is doing in terms of handling China. Because what Americans don't realize, and I'm talking actually of the most liberal, the most thoughtful American intellectuals and their perspectives on China, they don't seem to understand that the very idea that a 250-year-old upstart in world history could convert a 4,000-year-old civilization with 4 times the population and convert it to become a replica of the United States of America. And the very thought of it is so arrogant, and future historians will say, this is unbelievable. What were these guys thinking? So what we are seeing today in China is a very natural return of a civilization which over 4,000 years goes for 200 years, it goes down. And it has gone down for 150 years. And then it's coming up for another 200 years now. And it's just beginning to come out. And the idea that this civilization, when it wakes up, is going to forget its 4,000-year-old history and say, hey, I want to be like America.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's an absolutely stupid assumption that completely fogs American thinking on China, because at the end of the day, one thing that Asians who live in Asia know, that this is an old civilization. It will remain Chinese civilization. It will behave like Chinese civilization, and we can get along with it.
Okay.
But it will not become like us.
Let's stay with this theme a while. I want to get back to the question of what America's national interest would seem to suggest about the key areas of competition. But on that theme, what do you think from China's perspective, and not just the leadership, but I mean the Chinese people's perspective, or maybe those people who support the leadership, which I think Americans may or may not realize is a very large number of Chinese. The leadership has pretty broad support.
Only 93%.
Yeah. Is that, I gather one survey suggested that, gave that kind of number for, and you think we can trust that number? I mean, in other words, the survey results aren't influenced by concerns among Chinese that, of what will happen if they express dissent or anything. You think that's a solid number?
Well, I think all you have to do is go to China and travel around China. And, as part of my research for my book, Has China Won, I spent 2 months at Fudan University. And, the Chinese people have seen far greater improvement in their lives over the past 30 years or 40 years than they have seen in 3,000, 4,000 years of Chinese history. For the Chinese people, and it's important to remember the bottom 50%, through much of Chinese history, struggled to eke out a living, really struggled, okay? And then suddenly all these people now have what? They have houses, they have jobs, their children are getting educated, they get medical care. And you know what? If China was really a closed, repressive society, would 139 million leave China freely? Okay, it's about twice the population of the United Kingdom. And then these stupid people return to China freely.
So they
what
leave,
is supposed to be a repressive society.
So they go out on vacation and they could, and they could stay, but they come back. In other words, there are people. It's not like the the Berlin Wall. It's not like they're it's like it wouldn't be that hard to leave. They're not leaving.
No, they can leave. Anybody can leave China.
Yeah. So
now, COVID is a problem now.
So let me ask you, if you are, what are the things we do or say, by which I mean America, that most annoy them, that they think are most unjustified intrusions on, I don't know, their sovereignty or their pride or whatever?
Well, I think it's important. I want to emphasize that I believe that the United States and China can have a win-win relationship. Absolutely. Where the American people basically are better off and the Chinese people are better off. So that is the end goal of my writing. I think it can be done. But of course, it can only be done if you, number one, treat China with respect. America is the only country in the world, I think, whose leaders insult China.
In what ways?
I can tell you, no Asian country insults China.
What do we say that insults China?
You just have to read the speech that Mike Pompeo gave at the Nixon Library, I think on some anniversary of Kissinger's visit in 2021. And you can see the sort of speeches he gave. No, 2020. I mean, those sorts of speeches, the condescension, the idea that we're going to liberate the Chinese people, that the Chinese government is illegitimate, that the Chinese government is repressive,
Yeah.
and all these things. And the point is, if you really want to engage in a geopolitical contest, and I've been studying geopolitics for over 50 years, since 1971, the first rule of geopolitics is know thine enemy, know thyself, fight 1,000 battles, win 1,000 battles. And if you completely misunderstand China and you don't understand what its strengths and weaknesses are, then you will lose the fight.
Yeah.
And the Chinese, this is the biggest advantage the Chinese have over the United States of America. The Chinese leaders think long-term and have a long-term strategy for managing the United States of America. The United States, and as I say in my book, this was told to me, the conversation I had with Henry Kissinger, the United States doesn't have a long-term strategy. If you ask any person in the administration, what are you trying to achieve? What is your goal? Let me give you three hypothetical examples. Overthrow the Chinese Communist Party. Cannot be done. Isolate China. Cannot be done. Stop the Chinese economy from becoming number one. Cannot be done. So what are your objectives? So you have to learn to live with realities. That's what geopolitics is about. And the United States of America can remain the most admired society in the world even after China becomes the number one economy. Now, that's a possible goal. That's a realistic goal. And that's what United States should try to do.
So that takes us back to, in a way, my original question. You're saying that America's national interest lies to some considerable extent in just trying to become an admirable society, as it long has been, but not so much recently, I think. I mean, now that almost suggests to me that the answer to my original question is that in terms of actual competition with China in a more material sense than that, like competing over Taiwan or competing over the Belt and Road Initiative, right? Like feeling threatened by the Belt and Road Initiative, or for that matter, the issue of the South China Sea, navigation rights, or various islands belong to in the South China Sea or the East China Sea. I mean, are you saying those are none of those areas that an American president focused on national interests should be concerned about?
I'm glad you used the word national interests, because the first thing you need to do when you engage in a geopolitical competition, like the one the United States has launched against China, there's no question whatsoever that the United States has launched a geopolitical contest against China. No question. The trade tariffs, the efforts to set up the Quad, the AUKUS, all these are actions
the Quad
against China.
being this group of countries: India, Japan, Australia, and the US, right?
Exactly.
Right.
They're all and move to sort of in some way or another constrain China. But of all the issues that you mentioned, the most dangerous issue in US-China relations is Taiwan. Because if there's one issue that can actually lead to war between the United States and China, it is Taiwan. Because there's absolutely no question, and let there be no doubts about this. If Taiwan declares independence and says it wants to become an independent country, China will declare war. It's 100% certainty, and everyone in Asia knows this. So the best thing we can do is keep the status quo, which preserves autonomy for Taiwan, and that way you avoid a war. South China Sea, there'll be no war. Absolutely,
you're sure
no
of
war.
that?
Because the United States says its primary interest is to protect freedom of navigation in South China Sea. Now, the United States, as you know, is not a claimant to any territories in the South China Sea. If there's going to be a war, it could be a war between China and the Philippines, or China and Vietnam, or China and Malaysia, which is unlikely, by the way, and I'll explain why. But in the case of the United States, it says that it has an interest in freedom of navigation And guess what? The country that has a greater interest than United States in freedom of navigation is China. Because China trades more with the world than the United States does. So when the United States Navy keeps international waterways open, it is doing China a massive favor.
Although
The
isn't
Chinese actually,
there is an issue over the South China Sea that was taken to an international tribunal, right? And China lost, I gather. And I thought that was about, and did not respect the ruling, as I understand it. And I thought that was about something about navigation. That wasn't about the islands, right?
it was about. I don't think it's an island per se. It's a feature, I think. And the Philippines won the case.
Right.
And China is not going to respect it. But as you know, most great powers violate international law some of the time, not all the time. And as you know, the United States has a base in Diego Garcia, which the ICJ has declared that the British ownership of the base is illegal and it should be returned to Mauritius. And neither United States nor UK are going to abide by the World Court ruling. It's not surprising. That's how great powers behave. And so China will not abide by the ruling, but China is engaged in intense private discussions with the Philippines to try and find a solution.
Okay.
And that's a problem not between United States and China. It's a problem between Philippines and China.
Okay. So there's no real issue with freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. It exists, and China is not challenging it.
China would lose more if there's no freedom of navigation.
Right. So, okay, and as for Taiwan, it sounds to me like you're saying the less America talks about it, the better, because I've had the impression that China would just as soon live with the status quo for quite some time. I mean, its official policy is eventual reconciliation of Taiwan, integration of Taiwan. It would say back into China. It considers Taiwan to have always been part of China. But I don't think they want to invade Taiwan. And I've wondered whether the amount of rhetorical attention the United States pays to Taiwan, increases the chances of war, makes it harder, just arouses various forces that could cause trouble. Is that your view, that the less America talks about it, the less likely war will be?
Well, the one lesson of geopolitics is that when great powers raise human rights issues, it is only brought up when it is a convenient geopolitical weapon. So in 1971, when Kissinger went to China, and in 1972, when Nixon went to China, China was in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. The human rights abuses in China under the Cultural Revolution were off the scale. What did the United States do? It didn't see any of it. In fact, for all the years in which the United States collaborated with China, and it collaborated to the extent of putting up CIA listening stations in Xinjiang, by the way, against the Soviet Union. So today, when the United States expresses concern over Taiwan, to be honest with you, it's not because the United States cares about the people of Taiwan. It's because it's a convenient geopolitical issue to use against China and to say that China is threatening democracy. So I don't want to be too cynical, but if tomorrow the United States suddenly decided that China is very important, there's an asteroid coming down, going to hit planet Earth, and the only two countries that can fob it off is United States and China, Taiwan will disappear from the radar.
Right.
So it's all about what your interests are. And I actually think that the United States can find a better way of competing with China and not resort to this, trying to pinch China on small issues. it's much more important to work out a comprehensive long-term strategy which says, hey, for the United States, these are my fundamental long-term interests, right? And these are your fundamental long-term interests. How do we work together?
Okay.
And we have to disagree on some issues, and there will be disagreements on some issues. How do we manage the disagreements? Because at the end of the day, it's very clear that the final solution cannot be a war. Because if you do have a war, I don't know which city you're in, but LA will disappear, San Francisco will disappear, New York City will disappear. And that's not worth anything, right? A nuclear war. So there are some issues that can trigger a nuclear war, and we want to stay clear of that.
Yeah, I'm actually safe. I'm in New Jersey. I don't think anybody would bother with New Jersey. But let's stick a little bit with the human rights thing, because you brought it up. And first of all, it's interesting. You brought it up with respect to Taiwan, and that's interesting because China would almost naturally consider our objections over Taiwan to be kind of in the realm of human rights, because it considers Taiwan part of China. There are people in America who think of the China-Taiwan issue as comparable to the Russia-Ukraine issue in the sense that they think of it as a sovereign country. Now, and we've already talked about the fact that that's just not China's perception. Another issue, though, the biggest issue probably that comes up in the realm of human rights in the American conversation is, of course, the situation with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. What I assume that that's one of the things that the Chinese leadership and maybe many of the Chinese people don't want to be lectured about by the United States. How do they perceive that? Is it that they just frame the whole issue otherwise, or they think we don't understand why they've resorted to what they're doing, or do they think we're exaggerating what they're doing, or what? Do you have any sense for what the Chinese perception of the Uyghur situation is?
Well, the Chinese perception of the Uyghur situation is that the United States, when it was attacked after 9/11, decided to respond partly as an act of revenge, partly as an act of deterrence by invading Afghanistan and then invading Iraq, right? And it was seen as a retaliation against the 9/11 attack. The Chinese were subject to similar attacks from Uyghur separatists and so on and so forth. So when I was in Shanghai, I was told China also had its 9/11 moment. And that's when China decided to say, this will stop. This won't happen. And what's interesting is that the Americans say that the Chinese are not respecting the rights of Muslims in Xinjiang. Now, when the United States in the Cold War accused the Soviet Union of suppressing the Muslims in Afghanistan, the Muslim world agreed with the Soviet Union and supported the United States. Today, when the United States says that China is suppressing the Muslims of Xinjiang, not one Muslim government has agreed with the United States. And this is, we have a really strange situation in the world. Again, future historians will remark on this, that you have a bunch of Christian countries going to the UN expressing concern over the Muslims in Xinjiang, and 37 countries or 39 countries, including mostly Muslim countries, saying we understand what China is doing.
Now, some people might say that that's because a lot of Muslim countries need commercial engagement with China, or for various other reasons don't want to offend China. I suspect the Muslim country that's come closest to taking issue with China over this is Turkey, because there is an ethnic connection there. And I just want to focus on this for 1 second, because I want people to understand what China thinks the issue is. Okay, so the Uyghurs are Turkic people, and the separatists among them focus on that probably as much as Islam as a reason for wanting to actually carve off a part of what China considers China and divorce China. So I gather you said their 9/11. There was what there was some kind of terrorist attack or something explicitly over the separatist issue that I gather what was this the thing where it was like a mass stabbing and like 100 people were killed or something? This is the thing.
I don't have the precise figures.
Yeah.
You can Google and get the figures. But it was a traumatic event for the Chinese because the Chinese, as you know, if you ever go to China, you'll see how they live with great security. There are very few police around, very few people carrying any kinds of arms around or guns around. And then suddenly to have that kind of peace being disrupted by these mass killings, of course, that was a shocking moment for them. Now, you mentioned Turkey. By the way, Turkey is no longer part of that. Turkey didn't sign the letter that was drafted by the United States and Europeans.
Oh, did they take their name off it? There was a letter they signed, I thought, but
I think they were critical for a while, and then they have now changed their position. But just by the way, a very quick point about the fact that the Muslim countries may be indebted to China. Saudi Arabia is not indebted to China. Saudi Arabia is an American ally. Saudi Arabia is the custodian of the holy mosque. And I think this is one thing that I think many Americans find very difficult, to respect the intelligence of other states, which may be making decisions not necessarily on commercial grounds, but on purely rational grounds, saying, what will the 21st century be like? Who will we have to live with? And how do we work out a long-term relationship with China? And so I think that the countries that are making intelligent, thoughtful, rational decisions. And what I find very puzzling is that the United States has got the world's best universities, the world's best think tanks, the world's best newspapers, but it doesn't listen to the world. Amazing. It doesn't understand that there has been a sea change in the whole world's perceptions and attitudes towards China. Now, it doesn't mean, by the way, that they love China. It doesn't mean that they're going to become supplicant to China, but they understand that the return of China is the single biggest historic event, probably of the last 200 years. Together with the return of Asia, I want to add, by the way, as you know, I've just come out with a book called The Asian 21st Century or so. And so this is the big change, and we all are adjusting and adapting to it as intelligently as possible. And all these countries that are treating China with respect want to have good relations with the United States also. Mm-hmm. They want to see a strong United States, but they don't want the United States to say, you're either with me or you're against me.
Okay, I want to get back to that. First, I want to dwell just a little longer, because I know from experience that people who listen to these things complain if you don't dwell on this stuff a little longer. But the internal issues that we see as important human rights issues, I guess there's a couple of things you said that I might push a little further on. Maybe they're related. I mean, one is you said, China is used to having kind of civil security, internal security with very few police. Americans think of China as this surveillance state that, whether or not you see a lot of police with weapons walking around, is a state that, has cameras everywhere, has the social credit system monitoring people's behavior and so on, and so is oppressive in that sense. And perhaps relatedly, they might say, well, Americans, okay, so 100 people were killed in a terrorist attack, but still, what's apparently going on or has gone on in Xinjiang is, by American lights, seems massively oppressive. We hear numbers like 1 million Uyghurs Americans use the term concentration camps, which I think is misleading given what it suggests, given the resonance it has from World War II. That's not what these are like, but still, it is internment. It is involuntary confinement, apparently. So I just, you want to address either of those kind of closely related things?
Well, I think it's important to emphasize that there are 1.4 billion people in China. And there are 20 million, I think, in Xinjiang. And you mentioned cameras and policemen. Yes, I saw cameras and policemen in Xinjiang.
So you've been to Xinjiang. You've been to the province itself.
I went there in 2018 when I was researching my book.
And this stuff had started by then. This had started. The internment had started.
Yes.
Okay.
And certainly in Urumqi, you could see cameras and policemen everywhere. But what was striking is that it was the exact opposite of the rest of China. And if you go to if you see the other 1.38 billion people in China, they live without policemen. And I think I don't know whether you've had Ambassador Chas Freeman on your show.
I've met him. He hasn't been on the show.
Yeah, but I cite him in my book. He makes a very important point. If the United States had the same ratio of people to arable land as China, United States wouldn't have 330 million people. United States would have 4 billion people. Now, he said, if you have 4 billion people living in the United States, it'll be very crowded. And you therefore want to have more discipline, more order, more rules. And that's what Chinese society has worked out over 4,000 years. So when you travel around China, a lot of the discipline and order that you see in Chinese society is something that is desired by the population. Because in the Chinese mind, the one lesson of 4,000 years of history is that China does its most when there's chaos, when there's luan. And so the Chinese have this incredible deep aversion to chaos. And they love order and predictability and stability. And that's why in most cities, there are not many policemen.
Yeah.
And you walk around and there's no crime.
Yeah.
Okay. So you can go around Shanghai anywhere at night and nobody's going to rob you. And that's not because there are lots of policemen. It's because there's a culture that has developed in the society. And it's a very tough discipline. By the way, if you do break the law, the punishment is harsh. But that also ensures that very few people break the law.
Yeah.
So you can understand that when you talk of human rights, from the point of view of the Chinese people, and especially if you take human rights in the broadest philosophical sense, I studied philosophy, as you know. The first right, as you know, is the right to live, the right to eat, the right to be housed, the right to an education, the right to medical things. And now all these rights, more fundamental rights, the Chinese people didn't have, for the last 2,000 years. And today, for the first time in 3,000 to 4,000 years, China eradicated poverty. Zero. Now, that's one of the most incredible, impressive achievements in human history. And I want to tell you, just to emphasize why this is so important to me. When I grew up in Singapore, now Singapore is very wealthy. The per capita income of Singapore was $500. When I went to school at the age of 6, I was put on a special feeding program because I was technically undernourished, because I came from a poor family in a poor Singapore. And, we didn't have a flush toilet. We had gangsters killing each other on our doorstep. So I have lived through third world poverty. And I can tell you, when you have that kind of poverty, you don't ask, do I have the right to vote? Do I have the right to, speak out? In first one, you're more interested in surviving, getting the most basic needs. And in the evolution of Asian societies has shown that as you first got to deliver all this, then things change and things will evolve. And China can also evolve. And the best way this is the most important point. If you want China to behave better, don't insult them in public, talk to them privately and say, hey, we have some concerns. And Xinjiang, for example, I would say, yes, it's right to express concerns about Xinjiang. But, I've learned in life that you can either try to feel good or you can try to do good. You can feel good by condemning China and Xinjiang, but you can do good by talking to them privately and say, hey, can you think there's a better ways of managing this? And in the past, by the way, I think I heard a podcast interview with Susan Thornton, where she said there's been a very deep study done to show that the years of United States engagement with China did work and did result in Chinese changing their behavior on many issues through the process of quiet engagement. Mm-hmm. And that's what I recommend for the United States.
So you would not have taken the tack that Antony Blinken took in his initial meeting, if you recall, with his counterpart in China, which annoyed the Chinese to no end. I forget whether he explicitly mentioned Xinjiang. He certainly alluded to it. He certainly alluded to Taiwan. He certainly said we have big issues. And in return, he got a lecture from, I think, the Chinese foreign minister that was taken in America as being kind of aggressive. But I guess you would say, like, this is going to happen increasingly with a more assertive China if you make your criticisms public as opposed to private. That is if the U.S. government does.
But I think you and I know that the reason why Antony Blinken had to do that, and by the way, I just spent 2 months in the U.S. in October and December, and the level of anti-China sentiment in the United States is actually quite frightening to me. Because I've lived in the United States for many years as an ambassador to the UN altogether over 10 years, deputy chief of mission, Washington, D.C., 2.5 years. I lived in the United States for 15 years. So I can say with some confidence that I know the society. And there was a time when China was regarded as a competitor, which is understandable. It is a competitor, no question whatsoever. But now China is no longer regarded as a competitor, is regarded as the enemy. And therefore, Tony Blinken was not speaking to the Chinese. He was talking to back home and say, look at me, I stood up to the Chinese. But if you really wanted to influence China, what you should do is what all diplomats do. Make absolutely boring public statements, which say nothing, which actually are very useful. And then in private, you say, hey, we have some concerns. And then you get the results.
Yeah.
And I think that's the best way to approach China. And China is also becoming more and more confident by the day. And I think that's also the signal that young Jie was giving in his very strong response to Antony Blinken, that we will no longer take lectures. And at the same time, the thing that worries me is that the Chinese are also, as a result of all these American pressures, becoming more and more nationalists. And Napoleon once famously said, let China sleep, for when she wakes, she will shake the world. And now we're going through the period when the dragon is waking up. Now, if you want the dragon to wake up happy, don't goad it. And that's why the neighbors of China don't goad China. They don't do it. I mean, there are differences, serious differences with China. But you manage it.
And I want to be clear.
And so the best way of ensuring we don't get an angry dragon coming out is don't goad it. But all these assaults by United States are going to sadly create an angry dragon, which is not in the interest of the United States and not in our interest, the rest of the world.
And to be clear, first of all, when you say assaults, I think you mean rhetorical assaults. But to be further clear, I think you're not just saying that to the extent that we criticize China in public, the Chinese leadership will respond antagonistically. I think you're saying to the extent that we criticize them in public, the Chinese leadership will have more public support for a nationalistic policy. In other words, we are increasing grassroots nationalism within China.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in some ways, the conventional view of many Chinese scholars in the United States is that it was China's mistake to give up Deng Xiaoping's hide and bide stuff and all that. But when Deng Xiaoping advocated the hide and bide philosophy, China's GNP in 1980 was 10% of the United States in purchasing power parity terms. Now, if I am standing next to a giant that is 10 times my size, I will hide and bide. But in 2014, in purchasing power parity terms, China's GNP became bigger than the United States. So you expect this new giant to hide and bite and behave like a pygmy? That's so unrealistic. So obviously, China is going to become more assertive. It happened naturally. Just as the United States, as you know, in the 1890s, when Teddy Roosevelt became Secretary of Navy, what did you do? You seized territories. You declared war on Spain. You conquered Philippines, right? And that's why Graham Allison is absolutely right when he says, and I cite him in my book, he said, Americans keep wishing, why can't China be like us? He said, no, please don't wish for that. China today, in the year 2022, is where United States was in 1890. We don't want China in 2022 behaving like United States in 1890, declaring war on countries and conquering territories that belong to it.
Okay, now you said
that's that. So you got to understand at which point in history China is, and let us nudge China and push China towards becoming what I think Bill Clinton put this very well, by the way. I cite him every time in my speech. In a speech in Yale he gave in 2003, Bill Clinton said, if America is going to be number one forever, fine, no problem. We got the juice. We can do whatever we want to do. Then he added a but. But if you can conceive of a world where America is no longer number one, and it's going to happen within 10 to 15 years, by the way, then surely it is in America's national interest. I come back to your original words, national interest, to support stronger multilateral institutions, multilateral processes, multilateral norms, multilateral habits. And you know what all this will do? It will constrain China. And everyone in the world would support the United States when it does that. Because the United States would also be constraining itself. And it's a better world for all of us.
Yeah. And of course, the United States has not, in fact, respected international law very consistently. Clinton himself did not, with complete fidelity, respect international law, but it's probably gotten worse since then. And so, as you suggested when you talked about the South China Sea, it's a little hard for us to lecture China for defying the ruling of an international tribunal when we've done that kind of thing ourselves. Let me ask you
more than that. By the way, the United States is the only country that hasn't ratified the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and it's in America's national interest to do so. By the way, and by the way, Bill Clinton, incidentally, wanted to give this speech when he was president, and he was overruled by everybody. It's only after he stepped down that he had the freedom to express this piece of wisdom. But I can tell you one thing, though. He only said it once and never repeated it again.
That 2003 speech was the only...
In Yale. You'll find it in my book as China Won, and in the previous book, which I wrote on global governance called The Great Convergence, which tells the backstory behind that speech.
Yeah.
And the backstory behind the speech is fascinating. because all his advisors said to him, you cannot speak of America becoming number two as US president, because if you speak about America becoming number two, you'll be crucified. And this is the most amazing thing about the land of free speech, is that even though it is inevitable that United States is going to become the number two economy in the world, you cannot discuss it. You cannot speak about it. And as a friend of United States, I would say, hey, if it's inevitable, start making plans for it.
Yeah, well, the way I would have framed it, if I had been him and was just intent on saying it while he was president, is that what makes it inevitable that America's relative power in the world is going to decline is the success of the American model. Other countries have imported the basic approach to economics, and that's why they're going to become more prosperous. And we hope that as part of that, there will be at least more in the way of political liberty or pluralism. And we should probably talk about this in the context of China. But in any event, there's no doubt that it's largely because of the emulation of the American model that places like India and China have become more wealthy, that it was inevitable that America's relative power was going to decline. And therefore, as Clinton said, it would be in America's interest to establish a world in which laws are respected, and you don't have to worry about being invaded if you're not the most powerful country in the world. I think you and I agree on that, and I think it's really one of the great tragedies of American foreign policy that either there wasn't enough vision to kind of implement that policy, or beginning at the end of the Cold War, or there was too much political fear fear of the political consequences to pursue the vision.
One person who, incidentally, one of the wisest Americans who understood that the most important thing in any geopolitical contest is not what you do overseas, it's what you do at home, was George Kennan. And in my book, Has China Won?, I cite him. And he said, at the end of the day, the outcome of the contest between the United States and Soviet Union is not going to be determined by how many aircraft carriers you have, how many jet fighters you have. He says, ultimately, it depends on the spiritual vitality of your society. I was in Moscow in 1976, and I can tell you that Moscow was a dull and drab place. And you really could feel the secret police hovering over you. You felt that you were in a repressive state, right? Today, when you go to Shanghai and you go to Beijing, you'll be absolutely amazed by the dynamism of the entrepreneurs there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a bustling, thriving, modern cities that are in some ways more dynamic than many American cities today.
Yeah.
Right? And so at the end of the day, the United States should worry about the fact that it is generating a plutocracy at home when China is generating a meritocracy. And the real contest is not going to be about how big your navies are. It's going to be which society does a better job of taking care of its people. And in the last 30 years, when the same period where the Chinese people have seen the greatest improvement in 3,000 years of Chinese history, United States is the only major developed country where the bottom 50% has not seen an improvement for 3 decades or so. That's where the real contest is.
Yeah, and that's what you would have us. That's what you would encourage us to focus on: becoming an exemplary society, the society we were once thought of as being. You
can be again. You can be.
I hope. From where I sit, it seems like there are a lot of challenges, but I agree that with the right kind of leadership, we could be. There's our system seems to have trouble generating the right kind of leadership. But let me ask you. So I was in Beijing actually in maybe it was either 2010 or 2011, I guess. First of all, you're right. There was a tremendous sense of vitality. There was an interesting sense of kind of. People may think of China as a very regimented place, and as you said, there's a lot of like kind of law and order in a sense. but there's also, you almost feel like you're on the edge of order and chaos, right? I mean, there's a lot of kind of untrammeled energy almost. People riding bicycles with two infants perched on them, and so on. There's just, well, I guess it's a testament to what you were saying, that the peace, the civil peace, is not entirely dependent on regimentation. It's hard to describe, but you got that sense. Now, the other sense I got there was that things were good at that point between America and China. I talked to American journalists who lived there. They said it's great, air pollution problem, but they liked it. I thought, hey, it would be a cool place to live. Chinese were very friendly. And Chinese elites told me that they felt about as free as they'd ever felt. That in terms of what they could say, things had gotten better. It all seemed good, including fundamentally at that point, the relationship between America and China. Now, maybe in retrospect, there are warning signs, but I think what's clear is that things have become obviously worse on the China-America relations front since then. Now, you said earlier that you think basically America started this, that they started the sense of competition, of confrontation even. I suspect the American point of view would be, or a common American point of view would be, one of two things. They would either say, well, look, Xi Jinping showed up and he, unlike previous Chinese leaders, is just this kind of bad guy or something, or this very, or is, ambitious in a way that other leaders weren't or something. Or they might say, look, China's been doing these things all along that we should have been responding to. Survey. In fact, I'll give you an example. When I was there, I was given a USB drive. It was lovely. It had this kind of Chinese stuff on it, and it was free. It was a flash drive. Now, I think there are people who would tell me that I was crazy to ever plug it into my computer, because that would have been part of a program to infiltrate as many computers as possible and steal as much stuff as possible, which, for all I know, it was. I think I was so naive that I did put it in my computer. But anyway, there are these grievances that Americans have. They would say they've been stealing our secrets. They've been stealing our jobs, although obviously it seems to me that, look, if they stole our jobs as a result of you can't blame people for trying to bring jobs to their own country. Anyway, so that's an American view about how the trouble started between the two countries. What would you say about when we started causing problem, when America started the confrontation?
Well, I began slowly and it gained momentum. It started, I think, with Obama's pivot to Asia, as you know. And why did it happen? And Obama himself was very honest. The reason why he proposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership was because he said, if we don't write the rules, the Chinese will write the rules. And Obama did the right thing in signing the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And if the real competition that's going to take place between the United States and China is going to be in economics, by the way. And here, the amazing thing is that the Chinese have a strong, powerful, long-term trade and economic strategy, which is functioning and working. And China is signing free trade agreements with America's allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, Philippines. And America is retreating from free trade agreements. And, a future historian looking at this will say, this is shocking. That's where America made its greatness. It was the world's most open economy. In some ways, you're still the most open society. If there's one strength you have is your economic competitiveness, why are you walking away from economic competition? You're going to win it. You can win it. Whereas the Chinese today, surprisingly, have the cultural confidence to compete in that area. Now, when you ask me when things got bad, it's very simple. When Trump launched his trade war against China.
Okay.
That was an open declaration of warfare. And the amazing thing is that I know when I was in Harvard researching my book, it's Economics 101 tells you that when you impose tariffs, you're not punishing China. You're punishing the American consumer. It's economics 101. And Joe Biden himself said in 2019 in his campaign trail, all these Trump's tariffs have hurt American workers, American consumers, American economy. And yet, till today, United States cannot lift the tariffs. I was on a panel with some Harvard professors, and one of them says that America insists, we will not lift the tariffs until China gives us something. And so he said, the Harvard professor said, yes, that's like telling your opponent, if you don't listen to me, I'll shoot my foot again.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is that how you negotiate? I mean, those tariffs are hurting America.
Well, they can't
Now,
in the short term.
That's what they see. What you need to do, therefore, and you can work out in this area a win-win deal, which is a plus for American industry, American consumers. Now, China, by the way, has behaved badly in many areas. In fact, I have a whole chapter in my book devoted to how the Chinese alienated the American business community, which were the number one friends in America, how they stole intellectual property, how they imposed restrictions on American businesses, how there was no level playing field. The Chinese made serious mistakes. And if I was the United States, I would take that up very strongly. Yes, there are issues that you need to take up with China. But if you put tariffs on Chinese products, you know something? The Chinese trade surplus with the United States went up.
Yeah. I mean, I would say tariffs in the short term can in principle protect jobs. I agree with you that the part of it that's never talked about in America is that it's bad for consumers, and the people with the jobs are consumers. So they are it hurts everybody a little. But I would say there is more of a consensus in America than I think there's been in a long time that we need to use economic policy, possibly including selective tariffs, to protect workers. Right or wrong, that is something that seems to have political support right now. Just to be clear on what Obama was up to, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was going to be a Pacific trade agreement that initially would not have included China. I think there was some hope that China might eventually ask to be admitted, at which point it would be accepting the rules that were being laid down. In any event, that's a good example of something that fell by the wayside as part of the Trump populist resurgence that also brought us those tariffs. So anyway, you would say that it sounds like you would say there were signs of an American a hardening of an American position toward China as early as Obama, with the so-called pivot to China, which suggested that we needed to divert military resources from the Middle East to Asia. But you would say the big step came with Trump. The big confrontation came with Trump, and of course was exacerbated by COVID, which he used to political advantage. And I've got to say, I don't think China has always been helpful here. They haven't been entirely transparent, I think, about the origins of the virus, or at least they haven't been as welcoming as open investigation as some Americans would like. I think early on in the pandemic, there was what seemed to be a lack of Chinese transparency, which I suspect had as much to do with internal politics and bumbling and stuff like that as it did with any intent to keep the world deceived or anything. But in any event, all of that played into it, right? The Trump years plus COVID, that was a watershed.
I agree. I'm acutely aware of everything you say. I'm aware that there is this perception that China hasn't been cooperative and all that. And I agree that China hasn't been cooperative in many areas. But, international relations is a rough business, by the way. And everyone, you got to understand, and it's good to defend your interests. But a very quick note on COVID: one of the most prestigious journals in the world of medicine is Lancet in the UK. The editor is Richard Horton. He has published an article saying in January 2020, the Lancet published 5 articles warning COVID-19 was emerging. These are the consequences. Start preparing. Get your mask ready. get your hospitals ready. And he said many of these articles were given by Chinese scientists. And in January 2020.
Yeah.
So I think you really want to be fair. There were warnings that were very clear. And the other sad part of this is that the United States used to have a CDC office in Wuhan. And you shut it down as part of your efforts to disengage from multilateral efforts. And that's what multilateralism is about. Multilateralism means that there are CDC offices all over the world.
That was during the Trump years that we shut it down, I take it.
Yeah. That's right. So, there are things that could be done. And an important thing also to understand that the world is changing fundamentally in many ways. And the one fundamental way that the world is changing, that COVID-19 and climate change is telling us, is that in the past, I use this very simple boat metaphor. When 7.8 billion people were living in 193 separate countries, it was as though we were living in 193 separate boats. Okay?
Yeah.
So if your boat got COVID, I don't care. It doesn't bother me. I'm on a different boat. But the world has shrunk. The 7.8 billion people no longer live on 193 separate boats. The 7.8 billion people live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. So that's why when COVID-19 hits one cabin, guess what? All 193 cabins get it. So you're on the same boat. So why are you, this whole notion of sovereignty, we must protect ourselves. No point protecting your cabin if the boat is sinking. So you also, in today's world, if you want to be a responsible citizen of humanity, you have to protect your country and you have to protect the world, because your country is completely tied to the world. And that's why, you see, if the United States, when the global financial crisis broke out, Bush and Obama did the right thing. They got all the G20 leaders to come together. They said, let's save the world. And out of $1 trillion, China contributed $50 billion. Now, when COVID-19 broke out, what the United States and China should have done is said, hey, this is a common threat. Let's convene a G20 meeting. Let's spend $50 billion to vaccinate the world. And that would have saved the world.
Mm-hmm. Let me now.
That's what you need to do.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And I think, I think I definitely have views about what America should have done with respect to vaccine policy globally. So let me. I know it's 11. It's a little past 11 p.m. your time. I don't want to keep.
It's okay. I have a lot of time.
Okay, good, because I have a couple more questions. One is there had been hopes in America, and I personally put some stock in this idea that along with the economic liberalization, there would be some degree of political liberalization. Now, I know your view is that, look, if you're waiting for China to become a liberal democracy, you may be waiting a long time. And in any event, from the point of view of America's interests, it's not essential that it happen. But I have a slightly different kind of hope, I guess, is that leaving aside the question of whether China becomes a liberal democracy, there could still be some degree of kind of, you might say, political pluralization that accompanies economic liberalization. And an example of that, I've always thought was, Americans may not realize it, but there are ways that Chinese groups at the grassroots level make their grievances known to the government. And these have at times involved technology. I've read about, for example, when cell phones first started appearing in China, you would have groups of people that say they might be out in some remote area and have some environmental issue they wanted to bring it to the attention of people, some polluted lake or whatever, some grievance. And as I understood it, they would sometimes use cell phones to organize the movement. But there would be a movement, and it would come to the attention of the Chinese government. And I think people don't realize that there's a long tradition of China having, on the one hand, centralized rule, but on the other hand, having very elaborate mechanisms of feedback by which grassroots opinion in various places could come to the attention of the leadership. And I guess my question to you is, I mean, you might just say, look, more than we realize, there have been these feedbacks. There's almost been a kind of de facto democratic feedback, whether or not they're the elections we'd like to see. But my question is also, has technology in any ways empowered people at the grassroots level? Are they using it to express their opinion to the government and so on? Anything you want to say about any of that?
Well, the honest answer is that it's complicated.
Okay.
And it works both ways. You are absolutely right. Technology has been used to provide feedback to the government. I'll give you a concrete example, which I cite in one of my books. There was a major crash within two trains. And amazingly, the Chinese Communist Party in that neighborhood wanted to bury the evidence quickly. So they began digging huge trenches to bury the trains and destroy the evidence. Of course, lots of phones took lots of pictures. It exploded over the social media, and the Communist Party branch was embarrassed deeply, and they stopped. Yes, you're right. It can work. But the Chinese political system, as I say, is very complex. And if the Chinese government just relied on repression to maintain order, it wouldn't survive. It's got to gain legitimacy from below. And as you know, there's a Harvard Kennedy School study, which I mentioned earlier, which has, done with fairly thorough research, documented how support for the Chinese Communist Party went up from 86% to 93% over a decade, And it makes sense because, if your life has improved so much. And, when you go from the level that I did, okay, when you go from extreme poverty to having, I tell you, for me, the historic turning point in my life was when you got a flush toilet when I was 13 years old. I mean, you have no idea
I can
how
imagine.
how much more dignity comes to your life when you can flush it away, instead of having a mound accumulate over 24 hours, just to tell you, put it very bluntly to you. And all these people have had this massive liberation, right? And they're saying, hey, my life has never been better. And if you ask the average Chinese today, will your children be better off than you? I tell you, 90% say, of course, they'll be better off. They have far more opportunities than I ever could have. By the way, you can't say that in the United States, by the way, that their children will be better off. So that's where the real issue is. And we should not, China is such a massive, large country. It will find its own way. The idea that we outside can try to influence them, I think doesn't work. But I do also think that the best way to influence the Chinese, because the Chinese are an extremely intelligent and thoughtful people. And some of the best private conversations that I've had are with Chinese thought leaders in private. And their minds are open and they are curious. And if you give them a better idea, they say, okay, let me try it out. Okay? And so you can have, and you mentioned Xi Jinping earlier. In terms of quality of mind of leaders in the world, I would put Xi Jinping in the top 5% or top 10% easily. There's no question whatsoever. His understanding of history, his understanding of Chinese civilization. And by the way, Xi Jinping's main goal, and let me emphasize this, is not the revival of communism. He wants to make Chinese civilization strong again. He's driven by a deep sense of mission. And they feel that their hour has come. And paradoxically, therefore, the more confident the Chinese are, the easier it is to get concessions from them. The more insecure they are, the harder it is to get concessions from them. So it's in our interest to make them feel secure and work with them. And then, as I said, define what your core interests are. And for example, in the United States, to put it very simply, I have a son living in Pittsburgh, okay? Very near the park where the bridge collapsed. I walk in that park under the bridge, by the way. And when the bridge collapsed, I said, oh my God, where's my son? right? Now, the issue is not about how many aircraft carriers you have. Issue is, are your bridges safe? And the Chinese infrastructure today is stunning.
Yeah.
They're fast trains. And I can tell you, I'll give you an example. The president of Indonesia went to China. And he's building a fast train, by the way, between Jakarta and Bandung. And he took a fast train between two cities of the same distance. And when the journey finished, he said, I haven't finished my cup of tea.
Yeah.
How can this be?
Yeah, when I flew from the Beijing airport to JFK, I honestly felt like I had gone from a first world country to a third world country. I mean, I had never noticed how dilapidated JFK actually kind of seems if you've just come from some, futuristic place. But so you mentioned Xi Jinping. He wants to make Chinese civilization great again. The concern about from America's end, one big question is, what does that mean? What does that entail, becoming great again? One thing you're saying is that the more, in a certain sense, the more public respect we show China, the less we have to worry, because the less insecure they'll feel. I think you're saying that. But I think a big question in America, a big assumption in America, is that China wants to transplant its model all around the world. It wants to ultimately encircle America with authoritarian regimes, right, or autocracies, and I think some people would see the Belt and Road Initiative as part of that. So I guess I want to ask you, what is your sense for what the Chinese leadership actually does and doesn't want in terms of reshaping the world?
I'm glad you asked the question. I've been trying to think of some good news I can share with your audience. Here's the best piece of news I can share with an American audience, that Americans believe that they have a mission to improve the world, and the best way the United States can improve the world is by sharing the secret of its democracy with the rest of the world. And the more countries become democratic like America, then it will be a better world. And by the way, I agree that democracy is good, and I think it'd be good for the world to have more democracies. And I support that mission. But of course, the Chinese, by the way, unlike the Americans who think that anybody can be an American, the Chinese believe that only a Chinese can be Chinese. And only a Chinese can appreciate Chinese civilization. And if you try to go to China and you say, I want to become Chinese, they look at you, say, well, you can speak the language, you can sing Chinese songs, but you can't be Chinese. You got to be Chinese. And so the Chinese have absolutely no desire to convert the world to the Chinese system. And here, paradoxically, even though the Americans are liberal, they cannot accept countries with different forms of government. The Chinese are not liberal, but they can accept any kind of government in the world, and they will work with you regardless of your form of government. So people talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. One of the countries that is enthusiastically part of the Belt and Road Initiative is Greece. Now, Greece, as you know, is the mother place of democracy, and Greece will remain democratic. The Chinese have absolutely no desire to transform Greece in any way. All they're saying is, we can help you build a port. And, at the time when the Greeks were let down by their fellow Europeans, the country that saved them was China, with the investment in the port, right? So, and the Chinese will work with any country.
And
they really don't care what system you have. It's your decision. You choose your system. We choose our system. And this, by the way, is also under international law, the fundamental principle of the United Nations Charter, which is that each country should be allowed to choose its own form of government.
Mm-hmm. And what does China get in return for its investment, so to speak, in the Belt and Road Initiative? Is it that the economic terms of the agreement are sufficient incentive for China, or is it that it ultimately wants to not transform Greece's government, but to be able to exert certain kinds of influence on the geopolitical stage and have Greece vote with it in the UN or what, blah, blah, blah. I mean, what is the logic behind the Belt and Road Initiative from China's point of view?
Yeah. I mentioned to you earlier that the Chinese are very deep and sophisticated thinkers. And whatever you do, don't underestimate the Chinese. And so the Belt and Road Initiative has got multiple goals. Goal number one is geopolitical, because the Chinese anticipated 20 years ago at least that when they became stronger, United States would try to contain them, like the Soviet Union. How do you make sure that countries don't join an American containment policy? Get their economies linked to the Chinese economy. And that's the reason why China trades with far more countries than the United States does. Because if you trade more, you're not going to contain the country, your number one trading partner, because you're shooting yourself in the foot if you do that. Similarly, if you take a country like Laos, okay, it's one of the world's poorest countries. As Obama said, it's the most bombed country in the world in the Vietnam War. Laos today has a fast train, faster than any train in America, one of the poorest countries in the world. Now, if you are Laos, that's a manna from heaven. Can you imagine, will Laos become anti-China after that? They won't. So there's a geopolitical objective. At the same time, after the global financial crisis, the Chinese realized, and this is a very important point that most Americans are not aware of, they always invested in US treasuries, thinking that the investment in US treasuries would give them some leverage over the United States of America. But what the United States did after the global financial crisis was QE, quantitative easing. Quantitative easing destroyed the value of Chinese holdings of US treasuries. They had no more political value at all. This money was not making any money. Why not spend it in the Belt and Road Initiative? And you know what? The Chinese are getting a very decent rate of return of 6 to 7% on that money, more than they're getting from US Treasury bills. And most of their projects seem to be succeeding and doing well. And, most people think that the Chinese are putting countries into debt. There's a paper written by a New York professor, Deborah Brottingham, that points out it's not true. There's no evidence for that. And again, this is a very important point I hope any American audience will hoist in. Most countries in the world are intelligent countries. Most countries in the world are not stupid countries. If 140 countries decide to join the Belt and Road Initiative, it means that they have made a very intelligent, long-term calculation that this Belt and Road Initiative is going to help me, my people. I will benefit from it, regardless of what the Chinese get from it. So, so when the Chinese launch something like this, and this is a 20, 30, 40-year initiative, and the United States doesn't even have a 2-year initiative.
Yeah. Now,
match it.
The final, this is kind of my final question. I will, I know you have to get to sleep at some point. But a big concern in America is that China may impinge on free speech in America by using the kind of economic power it's accumulated. The classic example is the NBA, right? The National Basketball Association. You had this a guy who was president of a basketball team in America speak out about Hong Kong. China got upset and pulled, I don't know, did some restricted its relationship with the NBA in some way that hurt the NBA. There's also the movie issue that if Chinese movie studios want to enjoy the Chinese market, allegedly, they better be careful about how they depict China and so on. There's that whole set of issues. Do you have a kind of a line on that?
Well, 3 very quick points. One, the country that uses economic sanctions more than any other country in the world is the United States of America. Yeah. And unfortunately, to go back to Bill Clinton, you're setting a bad example for China. So whatever the United States does today as number one power, put sanctions on countries, that disagree with American policies, China will do tomorrow. Point number two, Kofi Annan and I, the late Kofi Annan and I, co-authored an article pointing out in the long run, sanctions never work. Countries will not change their behavior just because of sanctions. And quite often, sanctions have the opposite impact. And number three, if you want to get the Chinese to agree on some set of rules on do's and don'ts, what you do across borders, I would talk to them and figure out a set of rules and say, hey, you don't interfere in my domestic issues. And by the way, the Chinese will say is reciprocal. I will not interfere in your domestic issues. You don't interfere in my domestic issues. And at the end of the day, United States' best weapon is what's called the shining city on the hill. Use your example to change the world, not your aircraft carriers or whatever, and so on and so forth. So, in the case of United States, if your free speech can be undermined by foreign interference, the problem is not foreign interference. The problem is the weakness in your society. But if you have a strong and resilient society of your own, you can say what you want. You're not going to affect American society, American culture. And America is still a very strong society. So you can. So I think there are ways and means of protecting yourself. So for example, I can tell you that United States has shut down Confucius institutes, right? As you know. I think that's a mistake.
Now those were...
Because the Confucius institutes are one way you get to understand why this civilization is going to be so different.
Now, were there concerns about who was funding the Confucius Institutes or something? I wasn't really aware of this whole issue. It hasn't gotten much attention here. Confucius Institutes were, what were they? They were kind of cultural and educational institutions where you could learn about China. And what, did the Chinese government partly fund them or what?
Yeah, the Chinese government funded them. And they were intended to be Chinese language institutes and Chinese cultural institutes, and some of them, unfortunately, stupidly, began to say you can't do things, you can't say things. Then you agree with them and say you don't tell us what to say.
Yeah, okay.
Right? You can lay rules down and do that. But a Confucius Institute, by definition, will be a foreign object on your soil. But that foreign object is a way of you getting to know a very different history, culture, and civilization. And Chinese civilization is, an amazing civilization. Their depth of history there is phenomenal. And if we don't try to understand how that civilization thinks within its own minds, it'll be very hard for us to deal with it. So we have to go through a process now of learning about Chinese civilization and how it works, and then laying down rules and saying, you can do what you want in China, that's fine, but don't take what you're doing in China to my society, I don't want it. And then the Chinese will say, that's fine. That's how we Chinese do things. You can do things separately.
Yeah, I've heard you say that your book, Has China Won, is, I think you've said it's largely about America's failure to understand both itself and China.
Because, as I said, know thyself, know thine enemy.
Right. That's Sun Tzu.
Fight 1,000 battles, win 1,000 battles. And the United States neither knows itself nor China. And that's a problem.
That quote is from The Art of War, right? From Sun Tzu.
That's right.
Sun Tzu. Well, yeah. I spent all morning working on pronouncing your name correctly. You can't expect me to get all these Chinese names correctly as well. So I think the answer to your answer to my original question, what would you focus on? If your concern were America's national interests, you're basically saying, let China be China, focus on making America better in the context of its own ideals and values.
That's right.
And
keep your ideals and values.
Yeah.
And show that you do better.
Yeah.
Keep them.
Make America
hang on and make sure that the American people are better off.
Yeah. Okay, so I certainly I do encourage a project of national renewal in America. Unfortunately, Americans disagree over what exactly that should entail, and that's part of the trouble. But listen, I want to thank you so much. It is late there in Singapore. Again, the name of this book is Has China Won? The Chinese Challenge to American Primacy. I really encourage people to read it. But you also mentioned another recent book. You've got one other recent book you published. It's about Asia, not China, right?
It's called The Asian 21st Century, and it's absolutely free. It's an open access book.
Oh, my God.
That's been published by Springer. And you just Google The Asian 21st Century. And what is shocking about this book, Bob, is that it was released a month ago. And as of this morning, it had 412,000 downloads in 4 weeks.
Really? Well, well, congratulations.
Isn't that amazing?
It is amazing.
I mean, it's free, of course. It's free.
I mean, I think that's...
But of the downloads, 1/4 came from Singapore, 20% from China, 18% from United States, 15% from Malaysia, 14% from Australia. So it's amazing. This shows you how small the world has become. That, I published a free book 4 weeks ago, and it's downloaded all over the world. Yeah. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it is. And speaking of small world, I've heard you say elsewhere, and I know it's your view, that one reason we should try to minimize the needless tension between the U.S. And America is because there are big problems to solve, ranging from pandemics to climate change. So I really appreciate your working on that project, minimizing the tensions. That is. And thanks so much for taking the time. And I encourage people to read the book and to Google the Asian Peace Program, which is also your thing.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Okay, we're back to tape a brief addendum here in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which hadn't happened when we had the first part of this conversation. You've been kind enough to spend another 15, 20 minutes with us on this subject. I really appreciate that. Let me try to set the stage quickly. So I've heard a couple of different kinds of reactions from people who are trying to assess China's reaction to the Ukraine invasion. At one extreme, you have people saying, look, China loves this. Now the U.S. will be distracted. We'll have to devote more military resources to Europe, not only during the war, but for some time thereafter. So this will impede our pivot to Asia. China will have a freer hand in the Pacific and so on. Meanwhile, they'll get cheap commodities from Russia because nobody else is buying some of them, or fewer people are buying them. The other kind of reaction I've heard at the other extreme is, oh, this is very uncomfortable for China because they're kind of associated with this in a way. And part of the backdrop for that, of course, is that right at the beginning of the Winter Olympics, there was a high-profile appearance between Putin and Xi Jinping. They got together, kind of bonded, released a joint statement, which on the one hand, it didn't mention Ukraine, but it did call for an end to NATO expansion. It said that Russia and China had a friendship that was, quote, without limits or something like that. So the logic here is that China really doesn't want to be associated with a pretty plainly illegal invasion, and they don't want to be associated with all the publicity, all the atrocity and so on. So those are two different kinds of reactions. I've heard they're not really logically incompatible, that China is having a mixture of reactions, but I wanted to start off by asking what your take on this is.
Well, I would say the situation is complex, but overall, what's happened in Ukraine has been a major setback for China. And I'll give you at least 5 reasons. The first reason is that the Chinese to sustain their growth and to become the number one economy in the world, just need global stability. This Ukraine event has been hugely disruptive, slowing down the global economy, shaking up everything. And the Chinese, because of their civilizational history, just hate chaos. There's a word for chaos in Chinese, luan, which they hate. That's for reason number one. Number two, their number one partner, even if it's not technically an ally, Russia, would have been better for China to have a strong Russia rather than a weak Russia. Now it's very clear that Russia is bleeding in Ukraine. Russia has been badly hurt, and the financial sanctions have been tremendously damaging to the Russian economy. So now China's number one partner, which used to be strong, has become seriously weakened. And the third reason is that, China has been trying very hard to deal with Europe and the United States as two independent poles, and trying very hard to avoid a strong, cohesive Western alliance working together against China. And by and large, that strategy with ups and downs has been quite successful because the Europeans have their own interests with China and were quite happy to have a slightly differentiated policy towards China from the United States of America. But now, the biggest result of this Ukraine invasion has been a re-galvanization of Western solidarity. And clearly, for a variety of reasons, the strategic interests and perspectives of United States and Europe have converged. And this convergence of strategic interests in the Western alliance is a setback for China too. And then, of course, fourthly, there is a rather triumphant mood in Washington, D.C. that says, hey, guess what? We did it. We really fixed the Russians. We cooked their goose. And now we are winning this war, right? And so instead of dealing with an uncertain, maybe even nervous Washington, D.C., China has to deal with a strong, confident United States after the Ukraine episode. And the fifth point I make, of course, is that from the Chinese point of view, the biggest shock, maybe a nuclear shock that they got, was the effectiveness of the economic sanctions on the Russian economy. And now they must be thinking, gosh, how did half the central bank reserves of the Russian central bank evaporate, boom, right, overnight? Now, if Russia's got 650 billion US dollars, China's got $3.2 trillion. Now, what happens if $1.6 trillion just gets seized and disappear? That's a big deal. So I'm sure there's a major strategic rethinking in China about the real meaning of this Ukraine episode. And I'm sure that they're not happy and they're not celebrating.
Okay, now on that last point, the possibility that the West might do to China something comparable to what they've done to Russia in terms of sanctions, possibly including even seizing of central bank assets that are, I guess, assume the form of, U.S. Treasury bonds or whatever it is that gives us access to them, which I don't totally understand. But in any event, the only scenario in which I can imagine such a draconian reaction to something China did would be, at least among those kinds of Chinese initiatives that are discussed, would be the invasion of Taiwan, right? I mean, that must be something they're thinking about. And that's a kind of a complicated subject because in some ways that would be analogous to what's happened in Ukraine. China would of course emphasize the differences. They would, that although Putin has said, well, Ukraine was in some sense never really a country in the first place, the fact is its status in international law is clearly as a sovereign nation. Taiwan's status is a little more ambiguous even as it's framed in U.S. policy. Certainly in China's mind, Taiwan is not a sovereign nation. So I'm wondering, first of all, do you think that in terms of sanctions, the possibility of sanctions afflicting China, Taiwan is the main context where they are thinking about this? And more broadly, how do you think this has affected China's thinking about what they can and can't get away with in Taiwan in the future?
Well, you're absolutely right when you say that the Taiwan situation, Ukraine situation, they're not analogous, because Taiwan, you're right, is not a member of the United Nations. It's not an independent sovereign state, not recognized as an independent sovereign state. And by the way, even those countries which recognize Taiwan diplomatically recognize it as the legitimate government of China. They don't recognize it as the legitimate government of Taiwan. And China is actually very happy that they recognize Taiwan as the legitimate government of China, because it confirms the Chinese point of view that both of us are one territory, but you have two rival governments claiming control of that territory. So that fiction actually works in the Chinese interest. Now, you're absolutely right also about the Chinese thinking very hard about the implications of this for Taiwan. And for a start, I'm sure that militarily, the Chinese must be aware that even if you have a superior military force conquering and occupying a country where the population is against you is very, very difficult. But at the same time, you also have to emphasize that Taiwan is an island, and you can blockade an island. You cannot blockade a landlocked country like Ukraine. So there are fundamental difference there. But overall, I would say, regardless of what triggers it, it will be absolutely irresponsible of the Chinese officials not to start thinking about what would happen to China if any of the sanctions that US and the West has put on Russia are replicated on China. And by the way, I think I'm not an expert on international law. Technically, when you seize a country's central bank reserves, you are actually not to take away. It's an act of war. I mean, you're taking away a part of their sovereignty. They have a sovereign right to what they own. And so that's something that I think Russia doesn't have time to focus on now. But that's something that is surely a big shock to the Chinese. But I want to emphasize the point, not just to the Chinese. Many governments around the world, including, I suspect, a country like India, for example, which has now told Russia they'd rather have a rupee-ruble exchange rather than use the US dollar. Some of the Arab states are also moving away from the US dollar. The biggest danger that the United States has faced is that it's brought out its sharpest weapon. It's weaponized the US dollar. And now it's created a massive global incentive for countries, especially China, to in one way or another reduce their dependence on the US dollar. And so it's a tragedy, because, as you know, when the US dollar is the global reserve currency, it gives Americans an exorbitant privilege, to quote a French president, because the Chinese have to work very hard to send you iPhones, and all you have to do is print money, and you can pay for the iPhones. So that's the fundamental privilege of having a global reserve currency. And any economist will tell you this, if the United States ever loses the privilege of having the US dollar as a global reserve currency, there'll be a massive hit on the US economy.
Well, not only that, doesn't China, among other nations, stand the greatest chance of being the successor to the U.S.? I mean, should the U.S. cease to have kind of the global currency, and you assume that somebody winds up having one, isn't that likely to be China? I mean, in the near term, I think, for example, Saudi Arabia, I think, has said they will now start doing some transactions in the Chinese currency that they had been doing in the dollar. We're a long way away from that, of course, and it could be that the successor currency, if there is one, is none of the above. Maybe it'll be cryptocurrency. I have no idea, but there is that prospect, right? That it isn't just that the U.S. is kind of leaking a certain kind of soft power here, but maybe it is that power is going to China.
Well, I think it won't. By the way, it cannot happen anytime soon,
right?
Because U.S. dollar is so overwhelmingly powerful in the global financial system. Nothing can replace it anytime in the near future. And the renminbi cannot replace the US dollar because it is not convertible. There's no free capital movements in and outside China. So therefore, that almost disqualifies it for being a global reserve currency. But at the same time, I'm glad you used the word cryptocurrency, because there's some kind of digital currency, some kind of digital renminbi that is conceivable that the Chinese can create, maybe backed by gold, that people and countries can say, okay, I will use that currency for my international trading instead of using the US dollar, on the assurance that that currency is backed completely and not one subject to the whims and fancies of a government that can change it. So there is definitely a market opportunity now for China to create such a currency, but this cannot be done quickly or easily. And therefore, the Chinese will have to go back to what, in theory, they're good at, which is strategic patience. And they will now say, okay, we'll wait another 10 years, maybe wait another 20 years. Because now we know we're now dealing with a more formidable opponent than we thought we had. So that's changed the strategic calculation, even in the US-China geopolitical contest. By the way, I do discuss this subject in my book, Has China Won?
Okay, good. One final question. So we've just pointed to one sense in which there could be some good news for China here. What about the senses in which there could be some good news? You clearly believe, on balance, the invasion of Ukraine, especially given how messily it's playing out, is bad news for China. But what about some of these points like, well, more American military resources will be tied up in Europe in the future and so on? Is China looking at some of these things as the silver lining around the cloud?
Well, here's the American invasion of Iraq was a major geopolitical gift to China. And I've discussed this several times. Because the United States military was bogged down fighting a war. And when the US soldiers are losing their lives, Washington, D.C. gets obsessed and is focused on their war. The difference is that Ukraine is a proxy war. And as you know, the United States basically got a tremendous geopolitical dividend when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and got bogged down. And of course, the United States made the wise strategic decision to fight the Soviet Union right down to the last Afghan. And the same ways, I fear the United States can also have a similar geopolitical opportunity to fight the Russians right down to the last Ukrainian. So the United States will not be bogged down in any way in Ukraine. Ukraine is just all positive and no negatives for the United States of America.
Right. This is Russia's Afghanistan.
The people of Ukraine are suffering. Let me emphasize that.
Right. And that's terrible. But in geopolitical terms, this is Russia's Afghanistan. It's not America's Afghanistan.
That's right.
What's happening in Ukraine. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your taking the time. I know it's late where you are. And so thanks so much. And again, you've written a number of important and influential books. One of the most pertinent recent book is Has China Won? I certainly encourage everybody to pick that up. Thanks so much.
Thank you.